Hi there and welcome back to Lorena's Labyrinth. Thank you for joining me today. This is the part 3 of the series on unhelpful thinking styles. So if you haven't watched the first parts, I do recommend that you go and take a look at them. Today we're going to revisit some of the content, just in case people haven't watched the other videos. We'll do a gloss over some of the previous discussions, and then we'll go into looking at the other styles of unhelpful thinking, which includes personalisation, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, and what is referred to as shoulding and musting. And so we'll unpack that a little bit, and then we should be able to finish this series on the next video. So before we get into the unhelpful thinking styles, of course, it's just a good reminder here that when we're talking about thinking styles, quite often people can be either the top-down processor or the bottom-up processor. And what that means, of course, is if people process their thoughts, they feel the emotion first, they recognize an emotion, they can name it, and then they unpack the thought that is associated with the emotional reaction. A top-down processor, of course, feels or they're aware of the thought that creates the emotional response. The other thing to remember too is that with unhelpful thinking is that these unhelpful thoughts are actually generally below the subconscious and we're unaware of them. And so therefore the idea is that we unpack the thought, we find the thought, and then we can replace it, modify it, and address it. And it works, this style or approaches that I'm going to be giving to you, they work for people whether they're a bottom-up processor or whether they're a top-down processor. It's still about finding that key thought, the activating thought. And of course, just a reminder that our feelings are not thoughts, they're not beliefs, they are our emotional responses, and they're related to how we perceive situations and events that happen around us. And a perception is, of course, a thought. It's an idea, it's a belief, and it's totally different from a feeling or an emotion. In the previous videos, of course, we've also talked about the A, B's and C's, which of course is the activating thoughts, the beliefs and the consequences. And this is all part of reflective tools and journaling, if you like, to be able to unpack, to identify that thought that leads to these unhelpful consequences, because that's where we're going. We're looking at changing consequences, stepping into our power and creating the type of life that we want by unpacking these unhelpful beliefs and perceptions and taking a whole new perspective. And this is how we harness the power of our mind. And of course, the process of change occurs through us doing some detective work, which of course we've talked about in the other videos as well. I'm just mentioning it in case we've got people that are watching that haven't watched the previous videos. I do recommend, of course, that you do that first before going forward. But either way, the idea is that, through reflection, we identify the unhelpful thinking, and we then basically either prove or disprove this perception that we've got. We need to ask ourselves some serious questions, which we've outlined here, in an impartial way, as though we're presenting information to a judge or a jury about, is there any validity to these thoughts and beliefs that I have, or the way I'm perceiving this situation. And of course, we've got the string of them there. How realistic are your thoughts, beliefs, and expectations? So this is all part of stepping into mind power as well. And of course, we've looked at this before as well. So just a reminder, these will be the unhelpful thinking styles we're going to be looking at over this video series. And last week we spoke directly to mental filters and jumping to conclusions. We're going to expand a little bit on that this week before we look at personalisation and catastrophizing. So in last week's video, if you can recall, or if you haven't seen it, go back and take a look at it. We talked about a mental filter where the person's got kind of a tunnel vision and they only focus on one part of the story, and where it becomes an unhelpful thinking style, of course, it's when they focus on the negative and it's not evidentially supported. It's just something that leads to a negative based reaction from them and impacts on the quality of their life. Well, one of the things that crossed my mind, and I think it's worth a mention, but it certainly doesn't have, as far as I know, any evidence to back it up. This is just my observations working in the industry, if you like, or in the community bastion of healing and trying to work with people as far as the power of positive thought goes and this kind of thing, is that there becomes a different form of this mental vision of the tunnel vision, which is, I only see the positive. I've heard so many people say that to me, and then they end up in this situation where stuff happens and they're like, how did that happen? I'm a good person. I'm a nice person. Why did bad stuff happen to me? Well, quite often it's because they're not seeing the cues, or as other people might define it, there's an inability to read the room and to respond accordingly to any tensions or problems that might arise, because they're only seeing what they want to see and they're completely disregarding anything that might not support the vision that they want to see. So, how might I describe this? I guess it's the kind of person, and I've probably been guilty of this myself over time, which is that I find the sensationalistic reporting on the news to be quite emotionally deeply disturbing. So at different times I decided I was going to stop watching the news, because I just thought that until they actually bring news reporting back to reporting of news instead of sensationalizing and emotionally manipulating the viewer, then I would rather just go and read the news and scan over all this emotionally manipulative stuff. To some extent, I actually still support that, okay, because we have to be able to distinguish what is factual reporting as opposed to what is speculative. But anyway, going back to the tunnel vision with the person that says, I only want to see the positive, or I only see the positive, they might be looking at the superficial as opposed to the true intention of a person, and that will make them vulnerable. Actually, prime example, I know, we'll talk about, this might make them very susceptible to narcissists and people of very questionable intent that are seeking to use other people to get to a certain place or space in their life. And so we all know narcissists, they have this wonderful charismatic nature about them in the first instance. They're very likable, they're magnetic. That's part of why it's referred to narcissism. We get attracted to that initial display of them, and we can focus on their positive attributes and then remain ignorant and unaware of the other manipulations and devious behaviours that they're doing. And that obviously is going to cause us a lot of grief in our life. So we have to be able to look big picture and look at everything that's going on. We don't necessarily take on board all the viewpoints or opinions of other people, especially when we're talking about perhaps a personality type. And I'm just thinking, there's that situation where friends talk and then they say, well, I don't like that person, or I like that one because X, Y, and Z. I'm certainly one of those that the way I address it, if a third party wants to come and talk to me about somebody else and it's not necessarily kind and all the rest of it, I, as with anybody else, will probably become a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm usually pretty upfront too, which is telling them that I'm not comfortable with that, but I respect their right to feel the way they feel and to express what they've got to feel. But at the same time, this is not something that I personally have observed about a person, right? But I'm open-minded, I guess. But I think the thing is that once we become aware, we then observe more of what is going around us, and we're able to take actions that are self-preserving at the very least. And I guess in this way, where we're going to, this mental filter is also linked with boundaries. Perhaps the person that can only see the positive that's in front of them and refuses to see anything that doesn't support their vision, that might be a case of their boundaries are too low, but that's just something for people to give consideration to. So, just a reminder, I go to the clinical websites to actually get this kind of information and then I present it. Obviously, I don't do plagiarism of it, but I then present it to you for consideration. Now, with this point, we're talking about personalisation, but I don't know that I really fully agree with this as a description, but either way, it's still got relevance as far as flawed thinking goes. It's where you end up blaming yourself and taking responsibility for everything, whether it's your fault or not. This is the descriptor of personalisation. It's when things, according to them, it's when things go wrong or they haven't gone as you wanted them to do or the way you expected, and then you blame yourself for what's happened and you take full responsibility for the events that transpired. And they use a couple of examples here, such as the toast burning at breakfast and you blaming yourself for it, or if your child is in a concert and they're doing a musical instrument or whatever and they blow the wrong tune or tone or whatever, and then it's like, oh, it's my fault, I should have spent more time with them, I should have made them practice a bit harder. So you take on board the fact that actually the child didn't perform as well as it could have done. Well, it's not your fault, actually. Without realizing it, you are relating all of the external events that happen in your life, especially the negative ones, to being something that you have or have not done. Okay, now when we do this, we end up taking responsibility for the events that go wrong and ignoring the other important factors. So, this obviously is very unfair to yourself. Excuse me for having a croaky voice. It's very unfair upon yourself because certainly if there's other people involved, not everything is your responsibility. It might be partly your responsibility, but at the same time, people have to be responsible for their own actions. So even if it's your child that did a wrong note at the concert, the bottom line is that the child is growing and learning responsibility, and this is part of their life lessons as well, is to put in the practice without actually having mum or dad nag them to pieces to do it. Yes, you could have done it, but it's not your fault. So the point they're trying to make is, carrying 100% of the responsibility is a really big burden to bear, and it's likely to leave you feeling very discouraged and overwhelmed. Because at the end of the day, it's not your responsibility to carry the burdens for the entire world, and it's very unhelpful to accept responsibility for events and actions that are outside of your control, or to accept more responsibility than is your share. So, it's not just unhelpful to you, it's actually unhelpful to the person or the people that you're assuming responsibility for their actions and behaviours. So, basically what they're suggesting here is that to challenge this kind of behavior or unhelpful thinking styles, to look at it, every time you think, oh my God, it's my fault, is that you actually turn around and ask yourself, well, is this entirely your fault? Was this entirely your responsibility? Did other people have responsibilities to do certain things within this situation to ensure its success, And then the other thing is, what other factors might have affected the outcome? It could have been that your child did all the rehearsing and it would have been perfect and everything. You know what I mean? There was no more that they could have done. In rehearsals, it was great. But on the night, something happened that distracted the child, and not necessarily just your child. It could have been all of the children were impacted by what's happened. Perhaps, for example, there might have been somebody else leading them in the playoff or whatever. Perhaps health impacted. Perhaps, we'll call him Johnny. Perhaps Johnny was coming down with the flu that night. You know what I mean? So you look at all the factors over this situation, and I've got to say that if we're talking about the energy and the feelings, and emotions attached to taking responsibility for more than your fair share, it is very heavy. It is a very heavy burden to carry. It's not helpful at all. And if it's not a consequence of low self-esteem to start with, when you start taking on board those burdens, it becomes about low self-esteem. And if you're in an unhelpful relationship where somebody blames you for everything, well, that becomes difficult too, but you have to be able to separate. So, what is your responsibility, what's correct, what isn't. And I do have a couple of videos up as well about relationship boundaries too. So you might want to explore those if you're taking on board responsibility because other people are telling you it is, yet the burdens are too hard for you, or they're too high, or they're unreasonable. Then it's time to look at boundaries within relationships and see whether or not some of these burdens can be shared. So, where the last slide basically says that personalisation is where we take responsibility for stuff that we actually haven't done, or we overreach, shall we say, as far as carrying burdens of responsibilities go. It's actually jumping to conclusions that I would define as this ability to personalise everything and make everything about ourselves. And that's that. We talked about it last week as well, talking about the fact that when we assume, we make assumptions, we presume that we know what another person is thinking, what their motives are, and why they've taken a course of actions or activities. And we'll quite often see this demonstrated in our life with comments by people such as, it might be, I don't like that person, I don't like being around them, they did X and Y. And a prime example that I can think of was a story that was related to me by somebody that'd been doing FIFO, and they'd made a decision to not attend a family gathering because they were exhausted. They had a fly-in day. If anybody knows anything about Australian work situations, we have what's called fly-in, fly-out, and people will go away for work. Generally, they're up at 3 a.m. on their fly-out day when they're flying out to this remote area. They'll be on a plane for a couple of hours, and then they go straight into work. And generally, the first day on the job, when they fly back into the site, is fairly exhausting. And then they tend to work anywhere from, because rosters vary. They might work 5 days, they might work 7, they might do 14 fly out on the 14th day. But anyway, this particular person, they had done the 14-day swing, as I recall, and they flew in, they got into the city at something like 11 o'clock at night. And when you're on a mine site, you don't always get phone calls because sometimes there's not phone range. So anyway, the story goes that their phone was going berserk as they disembarked from the plane, and it was an invitation to a birthday party for their nephew the following day. And of course, they didn't get the messages in a timely way because of where they worked. And anyway, the story is they looked at it and they thought, I think I'm going to be too tired. It means I'll have to get up tomorrow morning by about 7 a.m. after doing a 2-week swing, and then do a drive an hour and a half up the road to go to a 2-year-old's birthday party surrounded by a bunch of children on a sugar surge. Now, I mean, that's perfectly understandable because, as the person said, they were concerned that they may not have the patience to be around young children. Their young children had grown up, they were adults by this stage. So they were actually being considerate and sensitive because they thought that the fact that they were fatigued would impact on their capacity to be able to regulate their responses and be the happy auntie or uncle or whatever. Now, the point being that at this family gathering, there was a family member that they hadn't seen for about 5 years, and there'd been tensions in the relationship beforehand. Anyway, what happened after the fact was that the family member that hadn't been around for a while made the assumption that the person didn't attend the birthday gathering because they were present, and that led to a massive rift in the family because there was this perception that the person that had flown in was just being, being splitting or whatever, just dog in the sand or whatever, and refusing to actually connect with this other family member, which was never the case. And the person said to me that from their perspective, they didn't really care if that family member was there. They could share airspace and sit there and, in fact, in some ways look forward to having an opportunity to have a family gathering with all parties present. But they just didn't feel that that birthday party was the right space to do it, which is fair enough. That's about knowing your limits, knowing your own health needs and all the rest of it. But anyway, so where I'm going with that is I believe that the family member that made this assumption, they took things personally. They made another person's actions about themselves and then became all bent out of shape over it for no reason. It was completely unnecessary. So, yeah, that's what I call personalising. So, when it comes to catastrophizing, a lot of the time people don't even realise that they're doing it, and it can be actually quite difficult to catch these catastrophic thoughts in the first place. Okay, um, once we learn how to identify them, of course, it's going to be so much easier. So, this type of thinking includes always expecting the worst kind of outcome in any situation and ignoring the good sides and simply focusing on the bad. With nothing in between, which is a level of black and white thinking. We'll be talking about that next. And where you consider yourself the sole cause is quite often actually the big problem with catastrophic thinking. But generally speaking, I personally believe that if I can speak, I can't speak it. Catastrophizing is basically that kind of stuff when people say, look, you're blowing things out of proportion or you're making a mountain out of a molehill. If they're saying it to you, then I would tend to say that it's probably being a little bit over dramatic, and it's often an automatic thinking that's associated with, like, oh, but what if, or oh my God, no, and they can be based on things that are really quite trivial, actually, like, oh my God, what if I blush? Well, so what? What if they realize I suffer from anxiety? Well, so what? What's going to happen? As they're putting it here on the slide, what's the possible outcomes? What's the best, worst, and most likely situation? And am I jumping ahead of myself? And bottom line is, how important is this in this big scheme of things, I certainly recall in relationships that I have had, there was one person, well, in fact, actually, there's been a couple of people that I've been associated with, and probably my children more so as they were maturing and that kind of stuff. And they, everything becomes a big disaster, well, what if, and oh my goodness me. And then you turn around and you just say to them, well, yeah, what if? And oh my goodness me. And if that happens, is the world going to come to a screaming halt? No, it's not, So let's put it into perspective. Let's just turn around and do the okay, if that happens, if the worst case scenario happens, well, that's okay. For example, if you fail your exam, that's okay. You will be able to reset. If there is a specific goal here, we will just find another way to achieve that goal, or we will reset the goals. Catastrophizing, though, is actually not usually a standalone thinking style. It's actually quite often associated with predictive thinking, that business of thinking that you know what's going to happen, because when I do X or Y, this is what people are going to think, or when I do X or Y, I'm going to fail that exam, like I said, or if you talk about in the workplace, if I do X or Y, the boss is going to be angry with me, I'll be underperforming and I'll probably lose my job. I'll never be able to find work again. All of this kind of stuff is catastrophic, I think actually when we talk about catastrophic thinking, probably the best example that we could ever have is, us old ducks will remember it, is when we were coming into year 2000, is that there were people that were predicting that the end of the world was going to happen because, how would the clocks work? Digital clocks would stop working. Computers would all crash. The world would come to a screaming halt, apparently, come year 2000. Of course, it never happened, okay, because, it just wasn't possible. So am I jumping ahead of myself? Well, yeah, quite often, right? Yes. What more can I say about this? I think I'll just talk about black and white thinking. So, black and white thinking is also a problem as far as being unhelpful. And examples of black and white thinking is these people that will turn around and say, well, there's no prizes for second place, because this suggests that there's only a winner and that anybody that's not a winner is a loser. And it kind of conveys that if the people don't win the race, that there's nothing that they can take pride in, which of course we all know that's not true, that, you don't have to be the winner of every race, but we can certainly take pride in our achievements, especially when we know the battles and journey that it might have taken to just complete that race or that activity. Another example of black and white thinking is the person who comes home with a B for maths, but they get A's on everything else. And all they do is focus on this B and adopt this attitude of, I'm a failure. Okay, these are examples of black and white thinking. Within relationships, it might be a case of black and white thinking is, if my partner and I don't always agree, then we must have a bad relationship. Or another one is, if I am not the best at what I do, then I am worthless. These are all examples of black and white thinking where there's absolutely no middle ground, just because we're not the best, as a prime example. We might not be the best. We might not actually be achieving those high goals that we set for ourselves, but we're still of value. You know what I mean? The end of the day is that journey, the effort that's taken to get to that point is often phenomenal in itself. And it's being able to recognize the value of ourselves as we aspire to these goals, and being compassionate towards each other as well, or towards ourselves, that, okay, we might not have won the race this time. We might not have got all A's, but at the end of the day, what we've done is put in a massive effort, and it does have good results. And if we were considering, there is that business too, that comparing ourselves against others is just unhealthy in itself. But I want to sort of make a point of, everybody's situation and success is contextual. So I do remember, if we're talking about academic marks and that kind of stuff, I do remember when I was at school, I was never interested in being top of the class. I certainly was a high achiever and I wanted to get good results, but I wasn't interested in being number one in any of the academic tasks that we were given. This is through primary school and high school and that kind of stuff. However, when I attended university, I did actually want to be in the higher grades. I should point out, by the way, when I say I was at school, I was always second or third academically in the class, and I was very content with that. That kind of met my goals. I didn't want to be number one. I was happy to be number two or number three, but if I didn't make the top three, then I knew I needed to put in a bit of extra effort. But by the time I got to university, I started to take it personally. Times have changed. I was in my 40s when I went to university, and I had a bit of a problem initially with the fact that I wasn't getting the high grades. And then I realised, you know what, life was different. I was actually working, I was a mother, I was a carer, I had all these extenuating things going on, and just being able to submit an academic paper and pass, that was what I decided in the first year of going to uni. Just to get a pass was okay. I was happy with that. Then once I got my first high distinction, then I got a bit of a taste for it again, and I wanted to get really good marks. I kind of lifted my game a little bit, and I went from being happy with a credit to wanting a distinction, and then wanting a high distinction. All a bit egotistical, really. But yeah, you have to, for healthy purposes, have a little bit of flexibility there, have to know the goal and be grateful for the successes along the way. That's that flexibility. Often we do see black and white thinking in the idea of good or bad or right or wrong. And the problem is that when we've got this black and white thinking, if we think it's not good, then it must be bad. And then we've got to get depressed about it and sad. If we think it's not right, then it's wrong, and that makes us angry. Just examples like that. The only times that I've actually seen, and I don't know about you, where it's helpful to have black and white thinking, at least to a level, is actually when it becomes about boundaries in relationships, which of course that's another video. And I had a gentleman talk to me about this years ago, because he told me we're Australian, obviously, and he was Australian too. And we were having the conversation that I believe that the world, this is going back about 25 years nearly. He was saying to me that I was too grey a thinker. I sat in the middle ground too much, and that from his perspective, life was black or white. And I asked him to give me an example, which he did kindly. And what he painted to me was actually boundaries within relationships, and it was about his work situation. He said, look, if my boss came up to me and said I was broke and I can't afford to pay you this week, there's been a hold up with the income, he said, and he promised to pay me the next week, he said, I'd cut him slack, he said, because I'm a good guy. He said, but if the next week he came up and he said, I can't pay you this week, it didn't come off, he said, I'd be going home from work. He said, because as far as I'm concerned, he gave me his word the first time. So he's about integrity, okay? So that's a little bit different, I think, but everything's got to be looked at contextually. Once again, leave a thought, leave a comment, let me know your views. Shoulding and musting is another unhelpful thinking style, and I think that we can all relate to this in many different ways. And largely, if we look at these comments on the slide, it's I should, you must, I must, these kind of things, right? There's an assumption also attached to this, or a belief, an expectation, and a judgment. And this is why it says judge the situation and not the person, is basically the tip for processing and unpacking this particular style. So I'll give you a couple of examples of it. Sometimes shoulding and musting is helpful, okay? It's helpful when we have personal responsibilities, such as completing a task for work, because obviously we've got obligations in the workplace and we get paid for doing a job. So if part of our job criteria is we should do X and Y, or we must do X and Y to meet that criteria, or to be able to generate a wage, or to comply with legislation, then yeah, absolutely we need to do it. Our survival is based upon it. If I look at the fact that in the workplace, when I was working in the psychiatric setting, of course, part of the job included medicating or providing medication support to extremely unwell people. Well, our criteria for that was we must actually ensure that we completed the medication charts, that we wrote down the times that the person had the medication, and that kind of stuff. We have a duty of care there. So yes, we must do that, and we should be very mindful. In fact, it's not even a should, it's a must, okay? So we can say there are examples. That's a perfect example of where shoulding and musting is important. We need to be able to do it for either our health or other people's health. At the same time, shoulding and musting, different types of shoulding and musting, is the placing of unreasonable expectations, demands, and pressures upon either ourselves or other people. Now, it can be from a psychological perspective. Let's say, actually, I've got a classic one. Okay, when I was a young person, I always thought that the perfect mother was like in Four Little Women, where the mother was this saintly person who never ever lost her bottle. She was always calm. And if you remember the main character, Jo was certainly a challenging daughter, but the mother just shone love at this child and never ever acted like her peace was disturbed. So obviously, for better for worse, this is what my belief was that a mother should be. Well, clearly I couldn't meet my own expectations, so that impacted on me and influenced my mood, because I felt that I disappointed myself, that I wasn't living as a mother to my own standards, because I was human. I was basing my sense of self upon an unrealistic example or role model. And actually, mothering is a really good example of, and something that I can relate to, because one of the other things that I used to do when I had my children, and so many people laugh about it, and they laughed about it at the time, and I couldn't understand. For me, it was I must do it. when my children were young, from the moment they were put onto solids, I was putting them onto a balanced meal, which was they had to have a certain amount of protein, they had to have white vegetables, green vegetables, and orange vegetables. And it didn't matter what they were eating, they had to have this full vegetable colour range, if you like, the rainbow. And so when people would come over and see what I was cooking my children for dinner, they'd be like, "Do you do this every night?" I was like, "Doesn't everybody?" I felt that was one of my obligations. So I put huge pressure on myself to actually achieve these goals. Was it realistic? Was it necessary? No, actually, it wasn't. It's okay to be flexible there, and sometimes it's not always convenient. And the problem with this kind of thinking is, and putting these kind of unrealistic expectations on ourselves, is that when we don't meet our own standards, we actually feel very guilty or disappointed. So, I sort of said that with this unreasonable comparison to the mother in the book as well. But then when we apply our values to other people as well, which is that person should know better than that, they should do better than that, other people should always do X and Y. Or, very simple thing is, I can't believe that they just cut in front of my car. People shouldn't drive like that. There's 2 points to this. There is the sense of feeling very frustrated and angry and disappointed. I think probably the disappointment is the most important emotional state that we end up feeling, which is why shooting and musting is unhelpful, is because it carries with it expectations, and people are people. They don't always meet what we would like to see other people do. And so invariably, when we have expectations of other people, not only do we feel frustrated when they let us down because they're being true to who they are and they're being human and, can't be all things to all people all the time, as the saying goes. Yes, expectation does lead to disappointment, and that is going to impact on our personal mood if we carry a lot of expectations toward others. There was something else there that I was thinking too, not just about expectation. I think it's with gratitude as well. When we expect people to do X and Y and they do it, it kind of, I think, starts to be a bit of a cross between entitlement. But when we stop expecting people to be who and what we would like them to be, then we start appreciating them for who and what they are. So, yeah, shooting and musting, I don't know if you can make sense of what I'm saying here. I do invite you to leave comments. We can talk about it more on the in the comments section on YouTube if you've got comments or questions, if we need to expand on it a little more. So I've just noticed again how long this video is. My apologies. I'm going to wind it up now and say thank you very much for being part of my journey. Hope that the content has been helpful. We will pick up the content on the other thinking styles in the next video, in part 4, and then hopefully we will have completed and be ready to go on to the next phase of adjusting thinking and speech and relationship enhancement, shall we say. So for now, once again, thanks very much. Have a wonderful day, glorious week. Catch you on the next video. Take care for now. Bye-bye.